35-year-old Judy Moylanen checked one more time that her 3-year-old daughter was safely buckled into her car seat, and then, with a sigh of relief, Judy climbed into the passenger seat of the van and nodded to her husband Bruce, who was at the wheel, letting him know that they were now ready to go. The car engine was already on, and the inside of the vehicle was nice and warm, and in another minute, they had backed down the driveway of their neat brick ranch house directly onto US Route 41. It was Thanksgiving Day, November 26th, 1992, and even now, hours before they would sit down to the traditional turkey dinner and prayer of gratitude, Judy was already feeling a little unaccustomed rush of happiness as she and Bruce headed west along 41 towards Judy's parents' house where they would spend the holiday weekend. Just 2 days ago, Judy had wondered if this trip would even be possible. Here, in Michigan's remote Upper Peninsula, Thanksgiving is almost overshadowed by the state's 2-week-long deer hunting season that spans the last 2 weeks of November. It's a time when the biggest fashion trend is blaze orange, and even visitors to the little town of Harvey, where the Moylanens lived, were more likely to ask each other, "Did you get your buck yet?" than they were to just wave and say hello. And on the first day of hunting season, Bruce had managed to bring home a male deer with a good-sized rack of antlers. But on the drive back to their house, after he was finished hunting, Bruce had hit another deer that was crossing the road, and that collision had totaled the Moylanens' Subaru station wagon. And it wasn't until the day just before Thanksgiving that the couple had been able to find and place a down payment on a replacement vehicle large enough to carry all of their luggage, as well as their 4 dogs. Unlike Judy's job as an assistant hospital administrator at nearby Marquette General Hospital, Bruce's side gig as a dog trainer meant that the family required a car that could accommodate several dog crates as well as 3 passengers. And the tan Chevrolet van was definitely comfortable as well as roomy. Within just a few minutes of starting their 2.5-hour drive, Elise had already dropped off to sleep. And with Bruce focused on how their new vehicle handled, Judy had a rare opportunity to just sit there and let her mind wander. Day to day, Judy's work was very demanding and she put in long hours. Even coupled with his dog training business and freelance work as an insurance claim adjuster, Bruce's main job as an instrument technician for Marquette General Hospital did not bring in as much money as Judy's regular paycheck. Not that Judy looked or acted the part of the traditional family breadwinner. Compared to her husband, who was 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and 180 pounds, Judy was just 5 foot 4 inches tall, with short, curly, light brown hair, and a quiet but practical manner. But behind Judy's oversized glasses, her eyes sparkled when she smiled. And she smiled a lot, just as she was quick to laugh at other people's jokes. And although Judy never sought out the social spotlight, in fact, that kind of attention would have just made her feel uncomfortable, her ability to listen and respond in ways that made others around her shine meant that people just really loved Judy and liked being around her. And there had always been more to Judy than met the eye. She adored her parents and her 2 brothers, and she was looking forward to spending the upcoming weekend chatting comfortably inside the snug family home with her mom and sister-in-law while Elise played with her cousins. But, like her younger brothers, Judy was also an outdoors person. Ever since she could walk, the woods in the back of her parents' home had been Judy's playground. And growing up in Ontonagon, with a population of just 2,000 people and a business district that did not have one single stoplight, there had been plenty of woods as well as fields and streams to explore. And so during that time, Judy had become very comfortable outdoors. She had also become skilled at handling firearms. So, in addition to enjoying plenty of time in the kitchen and in front of the fireplace, Judy was also looking forward to getting out in the forest with Bruce and her dad and brothers to do some hunting of their own. Hunting wasn't the only outdoor sport that Judy was really good at. She was also an excellent skier. In fact, it was that passion that had brought her and Bruce together back in 1974 when Judy was 17 and Bruce, who lived in a town even smaller than Ontonagon, was 20. But good as Judy was on skis, Bruce was even better. And at Porcupine Mountain, located right on the edge of Lake Superior, Bruce's ability and job with the ski patrol conferred a lot of status on a young man whose mother had barely scraped up the money to put food on the table for their 4 children, and whose father spent a lot of time at the local bars. So, at first glance, Judy and Bruce had been an unlikely couple. Overcoming his difficult childhood, Bruce had grown into a cocky and outgoing young man who never hesitated to speak his mind. Judy, on the other hand, came from a deeply religious, deeply conservative family whose morals and religious beliefs she shared. Her parents, Dale and Marianne Blake, had been high school sweethearts whose first child, Judy, had been born when Marianne was 21. Together, and for the last 40 years, the Blakes had owned and operated their own small automobile and oil business called Dale's Service. And as the Blake family grew with the arrival of Judy's two brothers, Marianne had supplemented their income with her job at First National Bank in Ontonagon, and then with the job she held now at Lake Superior Credit Union. But when it came to Judy's social life, even without her parents' tendency to be overprotective of their only daughter, Judy herself preferred reading and arts and crafts to parties and dating, just as she would have chosen a good piece of pie and a cold glass of milk over a bottle of beer and a bowl of peanuts. But when Judy and Bruce both wound up attending Northern Michigan University in Marquette at the same time, the attraction between them was irresistible. And on June 24th, 1978, 4 years after meeting on the slopes of Porcupine Mountain, Bruce and Judy were married. Afterward, the couple stayed in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, but they moved 120 miles east to Harvey. Once there, Judy established her career at the nearby Marquette General Hospital. Bruce, who started out in healthcare as an emergency medical technician, eventually took the instrument technician job at Marquette General Hospital. Along the way, Bruce had established North County Claim Service, a small independent insurance business, and Big Creek Kennels. And 11 years after exchanging their wedding vows, the couple had added to the ranks of the Blake and Moylannon families with the birth of their first and so far only child, Elise, now napping soundly in the back seat of the 1987 Chevrolet van. Just the thought of her daughter always made Judy smile. And ever since Judy had suffered a serious concussion in a freak accident the year before, she had been reminded all over again about the importance of family and friends. She knew how happy her own parents would be to have their adult children, plus all 6 grandchildren, together under one roof for this holiday weekend. Not to mention the added excitement of 4 extra dogs, all Springer Spaniels, just like her parents' dog, Streak. But even as Judy looked forward to the Blake family reunion and good food that now lay just 2 hours ahead of them in a hometown that she had always loved, she could not entirely ignore that sense of dread that had become so familiar to her. And it was just not a feeling that she had been able to share with her family or with Bruce. He was handy around the house, great about taking care of Elise when Judy's workdays stretched to 12 hours, and he was also a better cook than she was. But discussing and exploring their innermost thoughts was not one of his strengths. Looking over at her husband now, his big familiar hands firmly on the wheel, Judy reminded herself that this was not the time to worry. This was the time for her and Bruce to relax, take stock of their lives and blessings, and spend time together over the long weekend. And sure enough, after Thursday's wonderful Thanksgiving celebration, Judy and Bruce were able to put in 2 full days of hunting together while Elise enjoyed the attention of her grandmother and Marianne's own mother, Elise's great-grandmother Nemi. So on Friday, while Judy's brothers headed for their deer camp about 16 miles south, Bruce and Judy decided to try their luck at a hunting spot even further away. But at Dishnaw Creek, their attempts to drive deer out of cover were unsuccessful, and so were the hours they spent sitting quietly in small camouflage shacks called blinds. So by late afternoon, Judy was ready to call it a day. The falling darkness and the sound of howling coyotes suddenly made her wish she was back at home instead of growing stiff with cold in these unfamiliar woods. But even as she stepped out of her blind to call out to Bruce, from behind her there was the sound of a gunshot. Down a small hill and across the creek in front of her, Bruce was so alarmed by the sudden noise he practically leapt out of his blind, hoping it was Judy who had fired at a deer. Instead, he saw his wife approaching through the dark, just carrying her flashlight, not her rifle. The shot had been so close to where Judy was standing that the whole episode shook both of them. It was a reminder of just how dangerous hunters could be, not just to the wildlife, but to other hunters. After that, Judy and Bruce abandoned their blinds and headed back to their van. The next morning, which was Saturday, the couple felt much better, and so Bruce and Judy did not need any persuading to go hunting again. But this time, they decided to go with other family members rather than striking out on their own again. especially with hunting season about to close, everyone knew there were bound to be some hunters out in the woods who were going to be shooting at anything just to get that last buck. And by the time Judy woke up on Sunday morning, her only regret of the weekend was that her 4-day holiday was just hours from being over. She and Bruce had both come back empty-handed from hunting the day before, but better that, Judy thought, than just wounding a deer. That's what had happened to her cousin Mike, who had asked Bruce to get up early that morning and go back into the woods to see if they could find this wounded deer and put it out of its misery. As for Judy, while Bruce was out hunting, dropping in on some friends, and running errands before their return trip that evening back to Harvey, Judy was content to stay home with her sisters-in-law, her mom, and Grandma Nemi. After her mother had served up their traditional post-Thanksgiving lunch of turkey casserole, Judy was also glad to have the chance to give her mom a break. So, after everyone had finished eating, Judy urged her mother to take some time alone in her little office to relax and catch up on some bookkeeping for work, while Judy cleaned up and did the dishes. By about 1:15 p.m., Judy had the kitchen and dining room all squared away. Hanging the dish towel on its usual hook, Judy glanced at her watch and decided that now was a good time for her to take the 5 dogs out for their afternoon walk. Her younger brother, Jerry, and his family, who lived 4 hours away in Wisconsin, were planning to leave on Tanagan by 2:30, so Judy had just about an hour before she needed to be back with the dogs. As Judy pulled on her black down jacket, her parents' dog, Streak, was practically dancing with excitement at the signs that he was about to go outside. But it was the 4 much more obedient Moylanen dogs kenneled outside who really needed the exercise. They were the ones with a long night of travel ahead. Judy didn't bother with a leash. This was 1992 and the Upper Peninsula, and dogs were free to run around. A few minutes later, Judy called out a goodbye to her mom and opened the door to step out into the thick woods just beyond the edge of her parents' backyard. As she did, she pulled her coat tighter around herself. Not only was it already below freezing outside, but the air was so damp it felt even colder, and the afternoon clouds completely blocked the sun. An hour later, at 2:15 p.m., Jerry and his wife had their car all packed and ready to go. The only thing they had left to do was to wait for Judy so they could say their final goodbyes before heading home. And that is when the Blakes looked out the back window of the kitchen and saw Streak come running out of the woods, tongue lolling and tail wagging. Except that Streak was all alone. Judy and the other 4 dogs were nowhere to be seen. By 4 p.m., Judy's mother knew there was something wrong. For the past hour and a half, Mary Ann had been telling herself that Streak, who was not nearly as well trained as Judy and Bruce's dogs, must have just decided it was time to go home. And Judy was probably still out in the woods thinking Streak was out there too, lost or just wandering around. But by 4:20, Mary Ann knew she was clutching at straws. There was just no way that Judy would stay out this long walking the dogs or looking for Streak, and no way she would have missed saying goodbye to Jerry and his family. So, with Bruce and Mary Ann's husband and her other son and his family all out of the house, Mary Ann decided to leave little Elise with her great-grandma Nemi and go find Judy herself. And minutes later, Mary Ann was at the door putting on her coat and boots, but Mary Ann's first attempt to find her daughter failed. In fact, when Mary Ann had blown the dog whistle she brought with her, the sight of the 4 dogs running in her direction and still no sign of Judy had only served to turn Mary Ann's sense of worry into outright fear. And by the time she had managed to get the dogs back in their kennels and return to the woods, Mary Ann was on the verge of tears. So she didn't hesitate when her neighbor, Bill Dorvanen, who had seen the older woman picking her way into the woods, offered to help with the search. And grabbing his flashlight, Bill now led the 2 of them deeper into the woods. It was about 5 p.m., and the sun was just 10 minutes away from setting when Bill saw Judy's body. Mary Ann's only daughter was right in front of them, lying across the trail on her left side, her eyes open and blank in the glare of the flashlight. Judy's head was resting on a slight rise, and her feet were partly submerged in a pool of icy water. When Bill carefully turned Judy over onto her back, her arms fell to either side, and a moment later, both Bill and behind him Mary Ann could see that Judy's upper right chest was completely soaked in dark red blood. It didn't take long for the local sheriff's deputy and emergency medical technicians who had responded to Bill's 911 call to confirm what Bill and a hysterical Mary Ann already knew, that Judy was dead. In fact, by the time those first responders had reached the scene at about 5:20 p.m., Judy's body was already showing signs of rigor mortis, a stiffening of her limbs that suggested Judy may have already been dead for as long as 3.5 hours. Before the medics removed Judy's body, Sheriff's Deputy Tom Cusino had done the best he could to gather any evidence of what might have happened to Judy. Even though it looked like a tragic hunting accident, law enforcement would still need to find out exactly what happened and who may have fired the stray bullet that had killed Judy. But even though the deputy had made sure to take plenty of pictures of Judy's body and the surrounding area, all he could really see were scattered leaves and dog prints. And he already knew from talking to the Blake's neighbor that one critical piece of evidence, the original position of the victim's body, had already been compromised when Bill had shifted Judy's body to check for signs of life. Now, after taking Marianne to stay with another neighbor, Bill had rejoined the deputy and told him everything that Marianne had said about why she was out in the woods looking for her daughter in the first place, how Judy's walk with the dogs had lasted far too long, and how Streak had come without Judy. In answer to the deputy's questions, Bill said no, this was not an area where people generally went hunting. It was too populated and too close to the 8 or 9 families, like the Blakes and Dorvanens, that lived right behind the woods on Cherry Lane. Then, together with one of the ambulance drivers, all 3 men used flashlights to search for any sign of the bullet or bullets that had nearly ripped Judy's body in half. It seemed likely that the shot had come from a rifle, a type of gun that ejects its spent shell casings after firing, but after tramping around in the woods in the dark, the search did not turn up either a casing or a bullet. And so, after marking the area for further investigation, by 6 p.m., Deputy Cusino was ready to give the order for Judy's body to be removed from the scene, placed in the ambulance, and transported to the county morgue that was located inside Marquette General Hospital. Deputy Cusino already knew that the 12-person Ontonagon Sheriff's Department, which did not include crime scene techs, would have to get help from the state to investigate Judy's death. And that call for assistance went out to State Police Sergeant Detective Bill Ball at about 6:40 p.m., a little over 5 hours after Judy had left her parents' home to go walk the dogs. After getting the message that a woman had been found dead out and back of Cherry Lane in Ontonagon, 67 miles to the south, the 21-year veteran investigator immediately hopped into his cruiser. And an hour and a quarter later, Detective Ball was standing in the Ontonagon Sheriff's Department, listening intently to Deputy Cusino summarize what law enforcement had found and done so far. Detective Ball had a well-earned reputation for not making assumptions about the cases he worked on, and for being tenacious about gathering the facts he felt he needed before reaching any conclusions. So, after going to view Judy's body in the morgue, the investigator did not immediately agree with the deputy medical examiner's suggestion that, like most shootings in the Upper Peninsula during deer hunting season, this death was accidental. And even if it turned out to be accidental, Detective Ball intended to find out how it had happened and whose bullet had actually killed Judy. So, even though it was now pitch dark, Detective Ball, along with 8 other members of local law enforcement, including the sheriff and Deputy Cusino, headed back into the woods behind the Blake house where Judy's body had been found. And this time, using higher-powered flashlights, these searchers found something that the deputy's earlier search had missed. About 37 feet west of where Judy's body had been found, the sheriff was standing under a maple tree and pointing upwards with his flashlight at a fresh horizontal scar in the tree bark. Looking at that mark, both the sheriff and the detective knew they had just gotten their first potential break in the case. Because if that slash on the tree had been made by the bullet that killed Judy, then maybe they could figure out the bullet's trajectory and find the bullet as well as a spent shell casing that would help them identify what kind of weapon killed Judy. Detective Ball decided to order tracking dogs out at the scene for 9 a.m. the next morning, but in the meantime, at about 10:30 p.m., the detective decided it was time to talk with the grieving family. Deputy Cusino, who had informed the Blakes and Judy's husband at about 5 p.m. that Judy had been killed, now joined the detective, and a few minutes later, the 2 men were walking out of the woods towards the Blakes' home on Cherry Lane. Looking up at the lighted windows of the house in front of him, Detective Ball was already especially interested in one particular person, Judy's husband, Bruce. Because in every case involving the death of a wife or husband, the first suspect is always the spouse. A few minutes later, the investigators were seated at the Blakes' kitchen table. Judy's mother, Mary Ann, had been given a sedative to control her hysteria, so the investigators conducted their initial interview with only 3 family members: Judy's father, Dale, her brother, David, who lived with his family in Ontonagon, and with Bruce. According to Deputy Casino, Bruce had been dumbfounded by the news of his wife's death, and one of his first questions to the deputy had been to ask if his wife had been wearing a blaze orange when she was found in the woods. After being told no, Bruce had leaned his forehead against the hospital wall and gently pounded his fists into its hard surface. Looking now at the stunned faces staring back at him from across the table, Detective Ball kept his questions short and to the point. He was just here to collect first impressions, find out when Judy was last seen, and to find out where each of these people he was speaking to were earlier that afternoon. By the time he left the house a half hour later, Detective Ball knew one thing for sure. Every person at that table appeared to have a solid alibi for the 4.5-hour window between the time Judy left the house to walk the dogs and the time when her body was discovered. On Tuesday, December 1st, one day after the end of Michigan's deer hunting season, and 2 days after Judy's death, one of Michigan's biggest newspapers ran a story with the headline, "Deer Season Gets Safer." In that article, which attributed 4 deaths and 25 injuries to hunting accidents in the 1992 season that had just come to an end, Judy's death was listed as a possible 5th accidental fatality, but one that was currently being investigated by local and state law enforcement. Ontonagon Sheriff was quoted in the paper as appealing to anyone with information to please come forward. And 1 day later, on Wednesday, December 2nd, the day of Judy's funeral service in Ontonagon, Detective Ball received a phone call from the police department in Marquette, where Judy lived and worked. An officer there was passing along information from an anonymous caller, information that made Detective Ball decide it was time to head for Marquette to take a closer look into Judy's work life as well as her personal life. In the meantime, local officers were able to pinpoint the likely time of Judy's death to about 2 p.m. That's the time that several residents in the area had each heard a single gunshot coming from the woods behind Cherry Lane on November 29th. Detective Ball also had officers check out other leads, possible criminals who had recently been released from police custody, reports of unidentified or strange people in the area where Judy was found, and reports of anyone in that area who was seen carrying firearms. In addition, assuming now that Judy had been killed at around 2 p.m., Detective Ball ordered officers to double-check every alibi provided to them by Judy's husband, father, brothers, and cousins, along with the alibis of any other family member who was not actually inside of the Blake household when Judy was shot. But it was Detective Ball's decision to call in an Ontonagon civilian to assist in the investigation that would eventually give police their first real breakthrough. Armed with his metal detector, 42-year-old Dan Castle had earned a reputation among Ontonagon law enforcement for being able to recover hard-to-find evidence lost in the Upper Peninsula's dense forests. Now, on Thursday, December 3rd, Dan Castle was standing with Detective Ball and Deputy Casino at the exact place behind Cherry Lane where Judy's body had been discovered. A chemical wash applied to the blaze mark on the maple tree 37 feet away had revealed the presence of lead, a metal that is commonly found in bullets. Now, the man with a passion for finding buried treasure had the difficult, if not impossible, assignment of finding the bullet that had passed through Judy's body and then ricocheted off of that tree 5 days earlier. And while Dan was looking for that bullet, Detective Ball headed for Marquette County, where the Moylanens lived and worked. If Judy's death had not been an accident, the detective needed to find out who might have wanted her dead and why. It didn't take long for the state police investigator to realize that the anonymous caller had been right. Judy's life and Judy's past were much more complicated than Bruce and her family had led them to believe. Judy's co-workers and supervisors at the Marquette General Hospital would soon tell detectives why it had taken almost 2 weeks for the Moylanens to replace the station wagon Bruce had totaled on the first day of hunting season. According to the rumor mill, Judy was facing some serious financial issues, and just scraping together $500 for a down payment on the 5-year-old replacement van had been a big challenge. It would also turn out that Judy had recently contacted several of her creditors to ask about restructuring her loans, and when the bank turned down her application to refinance the couple's mortgage, Judy had mentioned to one of her coworkers that she and Bruce might be facing bankruptcy. But aside from learning about the Moylannons' financial problems, when it came to suspects in what could either be an accident or murder, the investigation seemed to be hitting one dead end after another. None of the reports of other hunters or suspicious people in or near the place where Judy died had turned up any viable leads. As for Judy's husband and other family members, police had not been able to find any hard evidence that would link any of them to Judy's death. Not only had Judy's husband, Bruce, prepared a list of people who could verify his whereabouts on November 29th, he had also willingly signed off on a consent to search form. That form gave police permission to examine and inventory Bruce's collection of firearms, as well as examine Judy's various life insurance policies, the payout from which could have provided a motive for Bruce to kill his wife. It would not be until mid-December that the state police investigator would get a series of tips that, together, would break the case wide open. The first of those tips came from Dan Castle up in Ontonagon. For 9 frustrating days, all Dan had found in the woods behind Cherry Lane were bottle caps and old coins. But on Sunday, December 13th, exactly 2 weeks after Judy was shot, Dan decided that before giving up the search for the bullet, he would try a simple physics experiment to pinpoint exactly where the bullet might have come to Earth. So, trading his metal detector for a slingshot and a pocket full of marbles, Dan stood in the exact location where Judy's body had been found and stooped to what he guessed would have been a point level with Judy's chest, where the bullet likely entered her body. Once in this position, Dan fired marble after marble at the blaze mark on the maple tree, and each time the marble ricocheted off the blaze, he made a careful note of where the marble landed. Once he had a cluster of marbles all in the same general area, Dan pocketed his slingshot and again took up his metal detector. And sure enough, in that area where the marbles had clustered, just 77 feet away from the maple tree and buried under a 2-inch layer of snow, Dan discovered a fresh bullet lying on top of the dead leaves that blanketed the ground. Dan grabbed his radio, and an hour later, Detective Ball was standing in the woods with Dan, both of them looking down at this critical new piece of evidence. And when the Marquette State Police Crime Lab ballistics expert arrived for work the next morning, Detective Ball was there waiting, sealed evidence bag in hand. And before the day was out, Detective Ball had 2 more important pieces of information. Crime tech experts had confirmed the .30 caliber bullet that Dan had recovered had in fact killed Judy. Embedded inside the bullet were not only traces of wood from the maple tree, but also fibers from the jacket and shirt that Judy had been wearing the day she was shot. The analysis also showed that Judy's death was no accident. According to the ballistics expert, the bullet was still rising as it passed through Judy's body before ricocheting off the maple tree, which meant it had been fired not from some great distance away, but at close range, and by someone who had put the sights of their guns squarely on Judy's chest. And by the end of that day, the lab had also provided Detective Ball with a list of guns that could have fired a .30 caliber bullet and left distinctive markings that matched the ones they found on this particular bullet. On the same day that Dan Castle had discovered the bullet that killed Judy, Detective Ball received a final tip from a hospital administrator at Portage Hospital in Hancock, Michigan, about 2 hours north of Marquette General Hospital, where Judy also had a job in hospital administration. 36-year-old Gail Lampinen wanted to talk with police about a person who she claimed had been stalking her and who also might have a connection to Judy's death. 2 weeks later, Detective Ball would hear a similar story about the same stalker from another hospital employee, Judy's good childhood friend, Leanne Wysocki, who was employed as a nurse at Marquette General Hospital. But it wasn't until Gail opened a box of sweaters that this stalker had given her as a gift that the police were able to connect all this information together to finally uncover the identity of the person who killed Judy Moylannon. and what they discovered would become one of the most sensational crime stories to ever come out of Michigan's remote and mysterious Upper Peninsula. Based on Detective Ball's investigation into the information provided by these two women, here is a recreation of what happened to Judy Moylannon on the last day of her life, Sunday afternoon, November 29th, 1992. After spending the morning inside the house helping her mother prepare the traditional Sunday after Thanksgiving lunch of turkey casserole and then washing up the dishes afterward, Judy was glad for the chance to get outside and take all 5 dogs for a walk in the woods that she loved. Even though Streak was not as well trained as the Moylannon's dogs, Judy figured he would stay with the pack as they walked. And if he didn't, Judy knew there was only one place Streak would go, and that was home to her parents' house. As Judy let her dogs out of their kennels behind the house, she pulled her black down coat a little tighter around her. Even after the scare she and Bruce had had when they were out hunting on Friday at Dishnaw Creek, when that bullet from behind them had come so close to where Judy stood near her hunting blind, Judy still hadn't bothered to put on a blaze orange safety vest for this walk with the dogs. Unlike Dishnaw Creek, the woods she now stepped into were too close to the houses on Cherry Lane to attract any hunters. And so, as Judy and the dogs stepped into the woods, the bright pink of her shirt collar was quickly swallowed up among the trees. But to Judy's killer, it wouldn't have mattered if the 35-year-old mother was wearing an entire outfit of blaze orange, because the murderer was not hiding in the woods that afternoon to hunt. The murderer, who was maybe just 50 yards from the path Judy was most likely to follow, was there to kill. And at this distance, hitting Judy was going to be an easy shot. And when it was all over, the murderer was confident that it would look like just another tragic deer hunting accident. Stray bullets had been known to travel so far in these woods that the hunters who fired them would have no idea that they might have struck a human and not a deer. And besides, Judy already appeared to be a very accident-prone person. She had a 5-inch long scar on her head from a concussion that happened a year earlier, and after that, there had been a fire in the Moylannon house that could have done some serious damage if the smell of smoke hadn't caused Judy to wake up and put the fire out. And whatever the risks, once this was done, once the killer had gotten rid of Judy, the killer would then be able to concentrate on 2 other women, Gail Lampinen and Leanne Wysocki. The first time Judy passed by the killer's hideout, the killer only raised their rifle and aimed, placing the sights on Judy's chest, but not pulling the trigger. This trail led to a field where the dogs could run, and then Judy would pass this way again on her way back to her parents' house. Better to wait, so anyone back at the house wouldn't connect the sound of a shot to Judy just having left for her walk. Sure enough, a few minutes after 2 p.m., the killer could hear Judy and the dogs once again approaching the killer's hiding place. This time, when the killer leveled their sights on the side of Judy's chest, they pulled the trigger. The gunshot seemed to echo like a bolt of thunder through the quiet woods, and one of the dogs immediately broke from the pack and ran in the direction of the Blake house on Cherry Lane. Even as the killer ran through the woods to the nearby empty lot where they had parked their vehicle, the killer knew they'd been lucky. Instead of giving chase, the other 4 dogs just stayed right where they were. As the medical examiner's report would later show, the single bullet that killed Judy entered her body just under her right armpit before exiting through her left rear shoulder, ricocheting off the maple tree 37 feet away and landing in the sodden leaves where Dan Castle would discover it 14 days later. On its way through the soft tissues of Judy's chest cavity, the bullet basically tore off the top of Judy's heart. After the bullet had struck and killed Judy, she fell on her side at a right angle to the trail, her head on a slight rise and her feet in a pool of icy water. All 4 of her dogs would stay close to her body for another 2 hours. That's when Judy's mother would also walk into the woods looking for Judy and blow the dog whistle that finally called the dogs home. There was nothing Judy's killer could do to retrieve the bullet they had fired, but the killer had made sure to collect the spent shell casing before leaving the woods. Later, the killer would use a torch to destroy the gun and shell casing before disposing of the weapon in the nearby Ford River. On December 13th, 14 days after Judy's murder, Gail Lampinen decided to open the 5 boxes that had been left on her doorstep the day before. Happily married, Gail had already confided to her husband about the unwanted attention she had been receiving at work and now apparently at home. But looking down at the pile of cardboard boxes at her feet, Gail was forced to admit that unwanted attention was an understatement. This looked more like the behavior of a full-blown stalker. Taking the first box into her bedroom, Gail opened it and looked inside. Neatly folded and packed, she saw a collection of women's sweaters in various styles and colors, but as Gail took each sweater out of the box, she realized they were not new sweaters. And a moment later, she pulled out a piece of yellow-lined notepaper. It was a letter addressed to her, dated 6 months earlier, and it was signed by Judy Moylannon, a woman, as Gail well knew, who was now dead. Gail had hardly finished reading the note before her hand was on the telephone, and a few minutes later, she was connected to Detective Ball's office, where she left a detailed message for the investigator. The letter may have been signed by Judy Moylannon, but there was no doubt in Gail's mind who the real author was. It was the same man who had left those boxes, the same man who had been sending her suggestive cards and notes, stopping by her office and showing up unannounced at the Lampinen house. It was, in fact, the same man who had been bragging to her just a few days ago that before long he'd be quitting his job as a technician at Marquette General Hospital thanks to a financial windfall that was about to make him a very wealthy man. And when Detective Ball returned to his office and called Gail back, he could practically hear the last few pieces of the puzzle fall into place. It would take months to prove their case, but Detective Ball and his team of investigators now had the bullet, the gun, the motive, and the evidence they needed to bring Bruce Moylannon, Judy's husband and killer, to justice. It would turn out the Moylannons' financial problems could all be traced to Bruce's poor money management, bad business decisions, and potentially fraudulent activity involving his insurance company, North County Claim Service. But Judy had only recently become aware of just how bad their money situation was. It was only when the couple's application to refinance their home was turned down that Judy had called the bank and realized that because of Bruce's money mismanagement, the family was facing possible bankruptcy and legal action. And, as Judy confided to a close friend, over the following weeks, Judy was learning more and more things about Bruce that made her scared and unhappy. Meanwhile, when Judy confronted Bruce about their precarious financial situation, Bruce became convinced that Judy would divorce him and take half of all of his assets. To Bruce, a much better option was to kill his wife and make it look like an accident. And while Bruce had insisted to police that the payout on Judy's insurance policies could hardly amount to more than $40,000, when police had searched Bruce's house in mid-December, they realized he was lying. While no single insurance policy on Judy was worth a fortune, Bruce had made sure he had taken out multiple policies on his wife. Hidden in an attic crawl space in the Moylannon house, Detective Ball had found a whole packet of those policies. And in the event of an accidental death, when the payout doubled, like a deer hunting fatality, when you added all the policies together, Bruce stood to walk away from Judy's death with a total of more than $300,000, an amount that would be worth $637,000 in 2022. The Moylannons' paperwork also revealed that in addition to a financial motive for wanting Judy dead, Bruce did in fact own a rifle that could have fired the fatal bullet that Dan Castle recovered. Listed as one of Bruce's assets on a loan application was a Remington 300 Savage, one of the weapons that the state crime lab said could have caused the distinctive riflings on the bullet that killed Judy. As for Bruce's alibi, he lied about that too. And once police interviewed every person on Bruce's list, they realized Bruce could not account for where he was between 1:45 and 2:45 on the afternoon that Judy was killed. But even though recent financial problems may have pushed Bruce and Judy to the breaking point, serious problems in the marriage had shown up at least 2 years earlier. That's when Bruce met Gail Lampinen at Portage Hospital when he was making a delivery there. Known throughout the hospitals in the area as an aggressive and awkward flirt, Bruce seemed to have fallen especially hard for Gail, even though she and her husband did their best to discourage Bruce from visiting and calling Gail. And once Judy was dead, Bruce launched an all-out romantic assault on Gail, one so obvious it prompted that first anonymous tip to police in Marquette, in which the caller reported that Bruce was stalking a hospital employee. As for the letter Gail had found, enclosed with the boxes of sweaters Bruce had dropped off at the Lampinen house, Bruce, writing as Judy, told Gail that the couple had grown apart and would soon be getting a divorce, and that Bruce would need Gail's help in finding a new partner, a woman exactly like Gail herself. But even without the handwriting analysis that confirmed Bruce was the author of the so-called sweater letter, it was the postscript at the end of the note that convinced Gail that Bruce had written the letter as a way of speaking directly to her. Quote, P.S. Don't tell the prospects, but believe it or not, Bruce is incredible in the sack. Not that Gail was the only target of Bruce's unwanted advances. The day after Judy's funeral, Bruce also started hitting on Judy's best childhood friend, Leanne Wysocki, a nurse at Marquette General Hospital, even going so far as to suggest that she might want to move in with him and 3-year-old Elise. And as Leanne reported to Detective Ball in late December, Bruce had told Leanne details about the shooting that had not been made public and that only Judy's killer would know, like exactly how the bullet had entered Judy's body just when her arm was swinging back, and how it was the perfect timing of that shot that resulted in the massive internal injuries that killed his wife. It would also turn out that Bruce may have made 2 earlier attempts on Judy's life. Back in 1991, so a year before Judy was killed, he apparently pushed an 85-pound chimney block off the roof of their house onto Judy's head. If the block had not glanced off of her head, Judy likely would have died rather than sustaining a severe concussion that put her in the hospital for 3 days with no memory of what had happened to her and a 5-inch gash on her scalp. A few months after that, Judy woke up one morning and found the house full of smoke. It would turn out that before leaving to go hunting, while Judy and Elise were still both asleep, Bruce had dropped live embers from the wood stove onto a pile of dry firewood in the basement. But despite the growing mountain of circumstantial evidence against him, it wasn't until Bruce failed a lie detector test and police showed him a copy of the sweater letter that he had written to Gail that Judy's husband finally confessed to killing his wife. On April 23, 1993, 5 months after Judy's death, Bruce told investigators, and later Judy's own brother David, that Bruce just couldn't take it anymore and suddenly went nuts. He told Detective Ball that in addition to threatening him with divorce, Judy had been a tyrant whose long workdays forced Bruce to do more than his fair share of the cooking and childcare. As for the timing of Judy's murder, Bruce said that it was just a lucky guess that Judy would go out that afternoon to walk the dogs. He said that the first time Judy had passed him on the path in the woods, that he just couldn't bring himself to shoot her. And then on her return trip, he said he aimed the rifle once and then lowered it and then raised it one more time, closed his eyes, and pulled the trigger. On December 15, 1993, Bruce Moylanen was convicted of premeditated first-degree murder. He would later be sentenced to life in prison without parole. The only time Bruce showed any emotion during his trial was when Gail Lampinen took the stand to testify against him, at which point Bruce began to sob uncontrollably. Judy's brother, David Blake, and his wife, Yvonne, adopted and raised the Moylanens' little girl, Elise. Judy's mother, Marianne Blake, died at the age of 71 on November 29, 2007, exactly 15 years to the day that her only daughter was murdered. The primary criticism of virtually every paranormal story out there is a lack of credibility. Either the person claiming the events happened lacks credibility themselves, or you just don't have any other corroborating evidence, like other people that witnessed it, other credible people that witnessed it, or in many cases, a lack of video or photo proof that said paranormal event happened. But in the case of the story today, you not only have a highly credible witness, a NASA robotics engineer, you also have other corroborating witnesses that are from that NASA engineer's family that were there and witnessed it with him, and you have albeit limited, you do have video footage of what they are claiming happened that was paranormal. But before we get into all of that in today's story, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, well, that's what my channel is all about, and I upload 3 to 4 times a week. So if that's your thing, if you could gently pulverize the like button and then turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my uploads every week. All right, let's get into it. Bill Vail has always been incredibly scientifically minded. He's always had technical jobs his whole life. He took a job for 15 years at NASA as a robotics engineer. He also spent a little time as a pilot for NASA as well. He is just somebody that is very process oriented. And in fact, his family and friends, they say this with respect, but they say that, Bill, he lacks an imagination. He's super pragmatic, super to the point, and doesn't really have time for, call it, creativity. He's all about facts. In 2002, Bill and his wife separate, and it catches Bill a little bit off guard. And it almost prompts like a midlife crisis for him where, before it had been really his work with NASA that had been fulfilling to him. And now he has this huge gap in his life. And suddenly, he's looking around and he's like, what am I doing all this for? I don't have a family anymore. Like, what am I doing? And so he decides to move back home to Arlington, Texas, where his little brother lived. So when he gets to Arlington, he feels like he can have a fresh start in a way. He has family around, so he doesn't feel quite as lonely, and he actually just takes a job at his brother's water purification company because he wasn't sure what he was going to do. He just knew that he needed to do something. So he gets a job at this water purification company, and he starts working with his brother, and he finds that even though it's not the same type of work that he was doing as a robotics engineer at NASA, it was nice to be working day in and day out with a family member. So Bill has only been living in Arlington for just a couple of months, and he had only been at the water purification company for maybe a couple of weeks. And so when a Saturday house call was called into the company and no one really wanted to do it, Bill thought, you know what, I'll take one for the team, make a good impression on my coworkers, and I'll take the house call. And what it involved is part of Bill's job was to go demonstrate how to install and use this water purification system in customers' home. The dispatcher for the water purification company said to Bill, she goes, hey, listen, this is a little bit weird, but the person who called was adamant that you be there at 5 o'clock, not a minute earlier, not a minute later. And it was probably only about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And he's like, so what do I do? And she's like, I don't know, like go get a bite to eat and just make sure you're there by 5. And so he does that. He's like, that's weird. But he drives around and he parks outside of the house a little ways down the street. And a couple minutes before 5, he gets out and he starts heading over to the property to do this house call. He starts walking up the path to this big brick house at like 4:59, and as he's getting closer to the steps, he can hear through the front door, which he can already tell it's slightly open, it's not latched all the way. He can hear screaming inside of this house. It sounds like a woman screaming, and it actually sounds like she's screaming, get out of here. But he doesn't really know what to make of it. He has a job to do, so he walks up to the door, and even though it's open, he knocks. And now he can literally hear through the crack in the door that someone in this house is screaming. And he's listening, and finally he decides, well, I should probably just open it up and make sure everything's okay, because I can hear someone screaming inside, the door's open. So he opens it up and he walks inside. He takes one step inside of the residence and just kind of peeks around, and he can see a little bit down the hall off to the right, there's an opening to a room. And in the room are 3 men on their knees in a little circle, and a woman is walking around them in a circle, and she's holding a book in her hand, and she's speaking in tongues. Just nonsensical, couldn't make sense of her language, but periodically as she's circling them and she's touching each of their heads, she's screaming, get out of here. Leave these people, get out of here. Bill is about to leave. He knows that this is just too weird for him, but right before he does, the woman who's walking around the 3 men on the ground looks up at him and points directly at him and doesn't break eye contact and just holds her finger out pointing at him. And he gets this very strange sense that like this woman wants to do harm to him. And so he just runs out the door and is like, yeah, I'm not going back in there. Goes back to his car and he calls the dispatcher back at the water purification company. And he's like, okay, I just took an insane house call. The lady in there is crazy. I'm not doing it. Don't reschedule. And if you do not put me on it because I will not go in there. Bill was a very straightforward guy. And he's just not going to let his imagination run wild with what they were doing. You know, those people are crazy and that's not my business. It's not my problem. And so he forgot about it. He just goes home to his house and he turns on the TV and he gets his microwave dinner and he's just sitting there eating his food and just having a nice Saturday night to himself, when out of the corner of his eye in his other room, and I keep in mind, Bill lives alone and has no pets. Out of the corner of his eye, he thinks he sees something small dart across the ground. He couldn't tell if it was flying through the room or if it was running through the room, but he just was like, oh, now I got, some rodent or a bird or something in my house. It must have snuck in through the chimney. And so Bill is not scared. He's mostly like frustrated that now he has to deal with some rodent in his house or some bird in his house. So he puts his food down and he turns on all the lights because he was watching TV with the lights off, turns on all the lights and just searches his house. He's like quiet, listening, trying to like hear where the thing went in his house, and he can't hear anything. And after over an hour, he just decides, well, geez, I don't know where it went. I don't know what it was. Maybe I didn't even see it in the first place. So that night, he wakes up suddenly to what feels like some small creature running over the foot of his bed, but like over his foot. And it instantly wakes him up and he instinctively sucks his legs up to his chest under his covers. As pretty much anybody would do when some random creature is running on your feet in the middle of the night. And he's like, great, this thing, it's probably, now you can tell it's a rat, it's a rodent. He's like, great, now it's literally in my bedroom on my bed. And so he flips on the lights and now he's just mad because this is right in the middle of the night. It's the last thing he needs. And he lights on and he searches the room. He looks under, his dresser, he looks in the closet, he looks under his bed, he looks everywhere. And he can't find this thing. He's stopping periodically to listen and he can't hear scurrying or anything. Did I imagine that as well? Because I guess I don't know if I saw something darting out of the corner of my eye when I was watching TV. I think I did. And just now, could that have been in my dream? Because he wasn't really awake for it happening. He woke up to it and thought it's what happened. And so he's starting to like tell himself that, you know what? I'm somehow creating this weird thought in my head. Like I probably didn't see anything downstairs and I was probably having a dream about this, rodent in my house, and that's what prompted the thought that something had touched my feet. And so he's like, all right, whatever. Turns off his lights and he goes back to bed. So Bill falls back asleep, but shortly thereafter he wakes up again when his bed is violently shaking. And he wakes up and his bed's shaking and it stops almost immediately once he's awake. And he thinks that they're having an earthquake. So he jumps out of his bed and he's looking around to see if like things are going to start falling on him. He runs to the window, he looks outside, he can't tell what's going on. He runs into the other room and he can suddenly tell, because he's in a bit of a panic, that there is no more shaking happening. Now the shaking's done, the house is totally silent. And he runs back to his bed and he has this thought like, could I in my sleep have shaken my bed? And he had one of those huge 4-poster beds and he's like trying to move it, and Bill's a big strong guy and he can barely move his bed, and he has this memory of my bed was literally shaking. And he's like, now this is 3 times that something strange has happened and I can't make sense of it. And being a very kind of pragmatic person and not one with, as his family said, a wild imagination, he did not have that. He's like, okay, let's find out if there was an earthquake. So he goes online and he starts researching earthquakes. And he's thinking maybe if the earthquake had just happened, that the news would break right then and there, some headline. There's nothing. And so he's like, okay, what other rational things could have caused my house to shake? Because again, there's no other damage in his house. Nothing fell, it was just, he felt the shaking and that was it. And so he starts researching like what's in the area, and he finds that there was a military base, and actually it's an air base right near his house, a couple miles away. And he's thinking, okay, well, when the fighter jets are taking off, that take off at all hours, maybe there's a sonic boom from one of the jets accelerating. And he didn't know if that was it, but he thought it could be it. And then he's like, oh, well, there's also all these oil rigs that are drilling in the area. Maybe there was an accident. So he's researching for, recent accidents at oil rigs. And he's trying to find a rational explanation for this bed shaking incident. He also can't help but feel like, what happened with that thing I saw that was like touching my feet? Like he's not connecting the two events, but he has this weird sense that either something's wrong with him and he's losing his mind, or something really weird is happening in his property. So as he's trying to find this rational explanation, his internet goes out. And so he tries troubleshooting it a couple times, but he can't get it to work. And so he calls his service provider to just have them see if they can fix it. And so he calls customer service, somebody picks up, and they're like, yep, your internet's out, let me fix it for you. Let me put you on a brief hold. And so they put him on hold, and as he's sitting there like listening to elevator music, like staticky sound started coming through the receiver, and he's just noticing it. It's nothing significant. But then a voice comes into the phone that is speaking in tongues, like nonsensical language, and it sounds almost threatening. At some point, Bill is just totally unsettled by this voice because it's just going on and on. He's been on hold now for like 2 minutes of this weird voice. He just hangs up. And like in just a couple of seconds, he gets a call back from the same customer service rep that he had just been speaking to. And he had an accent, and Bill picked up on it and said, hey, was I just talking to you? And the customer service rep was like, yes, sorry, we got disconnected. And Bill says, did you hear that voice? Did you hear that strange voice on the phone? And the customer service rep, who's mostly operates on a bit of a script, kind of deviates for a second and says, actually, yes, I did hear that. And I was actually trying to figure out how that could have been possible, because we use a very secure phone line when we talk to our customers, and there's really no way for someone to actually block my ability to speak to you. Like, even if someone was on the call, you would still be able to hear me, and I was trying to yell to you and you weren't hearing me. So I don't know how that would have happened, but I definitely heard the voice. I don't know what that was, and we're so sorry. So both of them are definitely weirded out by it, but the customer service rep, he's got a job to do, and he's like, hey, your internet works again, thanks, talk to you soon. He hangs up, and Bill's left with his internet working again, but now that's the fourth strange thing. He has the thing that runs across the room as he's watching TV. He has the thing that ran across his feet at night. He has his bed shaking, and now he has this like devil voice speaking in tongues on the phone that the customer service rep also heard and couldn't make sense of. He decides to, I'm done doing research for the night. It's 3 a.m. or whatever it was. I'm gonna just try to get a couple hours of sleep because this is just starting to freak me out a little bit. So Bill gets back in his bed and he's trying to sleep, but he can't stop thinking about the fact that there have been 4 strange occurrences in the span of just a couple of hours. And he can't help himself but start to feel a little bit worried that something that he doesn't understand is going on, something bad is going on. And as he's sitting there desperately trying to sleep, he swears he can hear some sort of sound underneath his bed. He knows it could be his mind playing tricks on him, but it doesn't matter. He thinks he hears it, and it's now he's officially spooked. Like a child, he pulls the covers over his head, and he's just laying on his bed with the covers over his head, just basically trying to convince himself like this isn't happening. There isn't anything under your bed. Just relax. Nothing's happening. He's got his legs sucked up, up near his chest. He's just under his sheets. And the way he was positioned is he had left a light on in his room, and there was a light basically beaming down onto the sheet that was over the upper part of his body. So there's a little bit of light into the cavern under his sheets. And so he's holding it up over his head. And as he's sitting there, like trying to tell himself that nothing's going on, he looks down towards the foot of his bed, under his covers, right? And he sees a hand slowly reaching up from the side of the bed, come up and try to grab his foot. And it just misses and then retracts out from under the bed. Bill literally leaps out of bed, flips on every light, and is now in just absolute crisis mode. He immediately is like up against the wall, doesn't even want to look under the bed, but eventually he does. He kind of pokes under, nothing's down there. He looks around his room, there's no sign of anybody in the room, and now it's like, okay, you've had so many strange occurrences, and none of it makes sense. Like, what are you going to do? And he had no idea. So Bill does not attempt to go back to bed that night. He goes downstairs, flips on every light in his house, starts drinking coffee like he's awake. He's like, I'm not doing this tonight. And so he stays up the rest of the night. So the next day, Bill just tries to have a normal day. He doesn't want to think about what happened the night before. So he goes to work like normal, doesn't tell anybody about it. Again, Bill, he's a straight shooter. He's not about to be, the former NASA robotics engineer that's like, hey, let me tell you about the paranormal stuff that's happening in my house. He's doing everything he can to not think like that. And so by the end of the day, he started to feel a little bit of anxiety as he's getting ready to go back to his house because he would have to potentially face some of the strange things that happened the night before. They could happen again tonight. And so he gets home, has all his lights on. He's not about to keep his lights off. And he's sitting in his chair he always sits in, the same one where he was watching TV and saw that thing dart across the room. He's sitting there and he's eating his microwave dinner and he's watching TV. Again, all the lights on in his house. And he looks down for a minute to get another bite of food. And when he looks up, a bottle is zinging towards him and he moves his head out of the way and it hits the wall beside him and it breaks. It's a glass bottle and shatters on the ground. And then all the lights in the house go out. So Bill runs to the closet where he knows he has a flashlight. He opens it up, reaches for the flashlight, and as he's about to pull it out, he hears in the closet, towards the top of the closet, this loud slamming sound. And he had a couple pretty heavy boxes on the very top shelf in his closet, and it sounded like someone had almost lifted one up and then slammed it down on the top shelf. But obviously he didn't do that, and it totally freaked him out. He grabs the flashlight, shines it in the closet. There's no one in there. There's nothing in there. And he backs out, and then the lights come back on. And his heart's racing because he knows what just happened. Someone just threw a bottle at his head. Someone just slammed something in his closet, and he's in full panic mode. And so the only person he can think to call is his brother, because he's not prepared to go to the police, because the things he would need to describe are kind of nonsensical sounding. But his brother, who's very rational, equally kind of pragmatic in his approach to everything, he calls his brother and he's like, get over here, I got some weird stuff happening in my house and I just need a sanity check. And so his brother, Bob, his younger brother Bob, he comes over. And as soon as Bob gets there, Bill is like, he had never had a discussion about the paranormal with his brother before. So he's just like, all right, this is gonna sound weird, but Bob, I need you to just go in this closet and just go in the closet. And Bob's like, what in the world are you talking about? And Bill's like, please, just go in there. I'm gonna shut the door and I want you to just tell me what happens. And so Bob's like, all right. Bob goes in the closet. Bill shuts the door behind him. Bill's just out there waiting. And Bill calls to Bob, hey, turn off the light. There's a little pull string, little tiny light bulb. Turn off the light in there. So, Bob's like, all right, turns off the light and it's pitch black in there. And so at the time, Bob would not tell Bill what happened to him in the closet. Mostly because if you put yourself in Bob's position, he doesn't have any of the context. He doesn't have anything that happened. He's never experienced anything like this before. And so what he experiences, he kind of chalks up to probably his own doing. He doesn't think that someone did it to him. And so what happens is he's in the closet and he feels something hit his leg. And he thinks, oh, I must have knocked into something that hit my leg, like a pair of shoes or something. And he's just standing there, and then something hits him hard in the face, and he thinks, oh, I must have hit something on the top shelf that fell and hit me in the head. But the two things combined, it did unsettle him a little bit, and he consciously decided, I'm not gonna tell my brother Bill that this happened because I'll only feed into his own paranoia right now, and that's not what he needs. Opens the closet, gets out, and he's like, you know what, Bill? Nothing happened in there. You got nothing to worry about. There's nothing in here. And so he leaves, and Bill is left kind of crestfallen because he feels like he really didn't do a good job conveying to his brother just how much had happened in the house so far. He basically said, I've heard some strange noises, go in the closet. And then nothing really happened. So he feels like out of his element. He just feels like he doesn't know how to handle it. And so he has only one other person that he feels comfortable kind of letting in to this situation, because it was just kind of embarrassing for Bill. I mean, he's this esteemed NASA employee. The last thing he wants is to have somebody think that he's like losing his mind a little bit. But he has his friend Michael, who is a sound engineer that worked for a couple podcasts. And when he calls him, Bill doesn't even really know what he's going to say to Michael. He just needed to talk to someone, like a friendly voice kind of thing. And he calls him, and Michael's a little bit surprised to see Bill calling him, and they have a little bit of small talk. And Bill says to Michael, I don't know how to approach this with you, but I moved to Arlington, and I got some weird stuff going on in my house, and I guess I'm just telling you because I don't know what else to do. And so Michael's like a little bit caught off guard and is a little bit just worried about his friend. And he starts asking him some basic questions, just, oh, well, what have you heard? Like, what have you seen? Just not really sure if it's even remotely worth exploring, but just asking some basic questions. And as they're having this exchange, the voice that came on the phone during the call to the customer service rep for the internet provider came on the phone. And all of a sudden, Bill can't hear Michael, and Michael can't hear Bill. All they both hear is this voice, this like angry, kind of demonic sounding voice that sounds very threatening. And so while this is going on, Michael just instinctively is like, well, I have all my sound set up here, and he grabs a mic and he puts it to the receiver and starts recording. And for 1.5 minutes, he sits there recording this voice. And then about 30 seconds into the recording, not that Michael could hear it, Bill on the other end, who's heard this voice before, and he's starting to get the feeling that this whole thing is bad. Like it's bad. And he starts yelling to Michael to hang up. Don't listen to this. Hang up the phone. Don't listen to the voice. He's yelling for him. And then after about 1.5 minutes of this chaos that Michael's recording, the voice suddenly stops. And it goes back to Bill and Michael talking to each other. And it's like crystal clear. And so Michael immediately says, hey, Bill, you there? You there? And Bill's like, yeah, I'm here. I was trying to get you to get off the phone. You can't listen to this stuff. I don't know what it is, but it's bad. And Michael just goes, no, listen, I recorded that. Here, let me play it back for you. And so he starts playing it back, and it's silence. Except for when Bill was yelling to Michael, don't listen to it. Hang up, don't listen to it. And Michael is yelling in the beginning to Bill like, hey, what is that? What is this? But then it's all silence in between. So they aren't speaking to each other, even though they're on the phone with each other, and they hear something, but the recording only picked up their voices, not the demonic, possessed sounding voice. At this point, Bill is starting to get a little bit scared. Maybe he wouldn't admit to it, but he's alone in this house and all this strange stuff is happening, and he just decides that he's going to invite his brother over for dinner. And Bill is in the chair that he always sits in, and Bob and his wife Cindy are on the couch, and they're kind of having a nice time. Bill recalled feeling, it was just nice to have other people in the house. And they're watching TV, and as they're watching TV, suddenly Bill just stands up and kind of runs over to the room where he had originally seen that thing dart by, this rodent or whatever he saw. And Bob and Cindy obviously see him get up and run over, and they're like, hey, what did you see? What was that? And Bill's like, okay, I don't know how to describe what I saw, but I saw this thing that's in my house. And, Bob, I brought you over here because I've just been seeing this animal or something running around my house, and I swear I just saw it. I swear I just saw it. And he goes, hey, look, Bob, sit in my chair, because it was the only vantage point into this room. The couch where Bob and Cindy were sitting, they couldn't really see into this room. And he goes, just listen to me. Bob, sit in my seat and just sit here and just watch the TV. Don't pay attention to the room. Just watch the TV and just see if something catches your eye. Because, maybe I'm seeing something that is totally rational, but something's happening. Just do what I was doing. And so Bob's like, all right. So he sits in the chair. Bill sits next to Cindy, and they start watching TV again. And Bob, all of a sudden, just clearly reacts to seeing something in the other room, and he goes, oh my God, what is that? And they all stand up, and Bill is like, well, what'd you see? And Bob's like, I don't know. It was like some kind of small animal or something, and it looked like it was on 2 feet. It did not look like a 4-legged animal. That's like a 2-legged animal. Like, what was that? And so Bob, he's now feeling like, I was in that closet, some weird stuff happened that I didn't tell Bill about. Now this, and he's like, okay, Cindy, his wife, Cindy, you sit in the seat. You do this now. And so now Bill and Bob are sitting on the couch watching Cindy, and Cindy's watching the TV. Of course, in just a matter of minutes, she sees something dart across the room. Now, was she just kind of jumping on the bandwagon because these two saw it? Maybe. But she certainly described the same thing that Bill and Bob claimed to have seen, which was a bipedal, small creature that was just running through the dining room. And so the three of them turn on all the lights, and they start searching the house. They're going to find this animal or thing in the house, and they search everywhere for hours, and they can't find anything. Finally, after it's getting late, Bob and Cindy are like, hey, Bill, I don't know what's happening in your house, but why don't you just come stay with us? We got a guest room. Just crash with us tonight, and you can come back in the morning and call animal control or whatever you want to do, but just you shouldn't be here tonight. There's too many weird things happening here. Bill, in a way, was actually kind of happy because now he had someone that he trusted and loved, his own family, that had confirmed that they were seeing the same things he was. That even though that is terrifying, that all of a sudden Bill is alone in this house with some creature, this small bipedal creature running around the house, at least he wasn't losing his mind. Or if he was, at least other people were too. So he was kind of relieved, and he was like, you know what? I'm not gonna go with you because I don't wanna just give up my house. What will I do when I come back if it keeps happening? Like, I don't want to just give this up. So Bob and Cindy leave, and now Bill is determined to now, for the first time, start looking up paranormal explanations for what was happening. So quickly, Bill realizes that you can't just search the paranormal. There's too many things online. It's so hard to tell what is considered like credible and what isn't, because there's just no fact checking going on. It's just people kind of putting things on the internet. And so what he decided he would do is, instead of him doing the research, he would find a paranormal investigative team that at least appeared to approach their investigations much the way a scientist would. That instead of looking for proof, the paranormal exists, instead that their approach would be like looking for an answer, even if that answer was totally normal. And so he starts researching for investigative paranormal teams that have a scientific focus that are in Texas in the area. And he actually finds one, and he reaches out to them, and they were actually available that night to come over. So he says, please come over, I need your help. So the leader of the paranormal team was a man by the name of Brian Hall. And when they get there, it's Brian and a couple of his crew members. They don't start with, diving into the paranormal investigation side. They start by looking for obvious answers, because they've found that many times when someone claims they have a paranormal event happening, it's something like, a bad AC unit, or a creaky door, or a branch outside that's rubbing against the house. And so they did a very lengthy and thorough examination of the outside and inside of the house, looking for things like that. And they determined that there wasn't anything obvious that was a rational explanation, so now it warranted setting up some equipment. And so what they did is they set up a couple of cameras in Bill's bedroom, where a lot of the activities apparently was happening, and they set up these laser beams that basically beamed lasers in every direction, and they would place them in his bedroom. So there was like laser beams all over the room, and if anything walked past any of these lasers, you would see the beams move, and it's very obvious. So it's a way to detect motion in the room. And so they set these beams up, and they start filming, and for a long time, nothing is happening. Bill, Brian Hall, the team are just sitting in the dining room downstairs, just like listening to silence and watching nothing happen. And so Brian suggests, hey, why don't one of his team members go up and just literally interact with the room a little bit? Go in there, kind of like yell, do something, kind of stir it up, so to speak, and then we'll see if anything happens. And so one of the team members goes up to the room and walks in and is like, hey, is anybody in here? And, nothing's happening. You can see on the footage that, he jumps onto the bed and he's sitting on the bed. And at some point, as he's yelling out to whatever was in the room, like, hey, if you're in here, show yourself, all of a sudden on camera, you hear a laser fall. And he jumps out of bed and he runs out of the room. And the rest of the team comes up and they gather up the cameras and they immediately watch the footage. And as they're watching the footage, you can see this mist that begins to form in the room that the team member who was in there just didn't see. And the mist starts swirling in front of the laser beams on the camera before you hear off camera one of the laser beams falling to the ground. So at first they're just kind of dumbfounded, and they're like, well, how did the mist get in there? Like, what is that? And is it possible that perhaps the laser beam rolled off a table or something? Maybe it was positioned in such a way that it could have rolled off. And so what they did is they raised the sound levels inside of the actual video, and they made out a couple of words. And so at this point, Brian Hall and his team feel like they have quite a bit of data that actually does lend credibility to the idea that there is something paranormal happening in Bill's house. So as they're packing up to leave, they say to Bill, like, you gotta go. You can't be here. Like, I'm surprised you're still here now. And Bill just was this super prideful guy, and he just was like, no, I'm gonna stay. Like, I've made the decision. I'm not gonna run. I'm gonna stay here in this house. And they're like, that's a bad idea. And honestly, they were right, because some pretty horrible stuff happens after they leave. So that night, he knows he's not gonna sleep. So he has all his lights on in his bedroom. He's sitting with his knees tucked up to his chin. He has upbeat music, like classical music, but very upbeat music playing on the radio right next to his bedside. And he's just trying to like kind of create good vibes in his room. And so as he's sitting there, he hears what sounds like a Mack truck smashing into the side of his house. Like, it was so loud and just deafening that he instantly sprints out of his door, runs downstairs, runs outside to like inspect the damage to his property. And nothing's outside. There's nothing. There's no Mack truck. There's no damage to his house. There's nothing. He walks all around his property. He's like, did something fall in the street? Am I losing my mind? Like, what's going on? And so he goes back in the house after quite a bit of looking around, seeing if something might have fallen off of his roof that made a sound. Nothing. He goes back in his house, and as soon as he steps foot in his house, he hears a similarly loud crashing sound, as if, a vehicle is smashing into his house, except it's inside of his house, in his dining room. It was in the same room where he first initially spotted that thing running across the ground. And so he runs in there to look for some horrible damage to the inside of his house, but there's nothing disturbed. There's nothing shaking. There's nothing out of place. His dining room is intact. And as he's sitting there, he hears his car alarm go off outside. And now he's thinking, this thing is screwing with me. I'm not going to let it win. I've stayed here against better judgment for multiple days. I'm not going to give in now. And so Bill kind of goes into fight mode. Now he's mad. And instead of being scared of what's happening, he starts screaming at the top of his lungs, like, show yourself. And so as he's doing that, he hears yet another loud crashing sound up in his bedroom. And so he runs upstairs ready to fight with whatever this is in his house, because it's gotten to a breaking point for Bill. He charges in his room. There's nothing in there. But unlike the dining room, and unlike when he was outside, the crashing sound continues while he's in the bedroom. So he's standing in his bedroom, holding his ears from the deafening crashing sounds over and over and over again, but there's nothing moving. There is no way for the sound to be emanating from that room, but it is. And after what feels like an eternity of this horrible smashing sound, it just completely stops. And it's dead silence. And Bill lifts his hands off his ears and he's looking around, and he's expecting it to start again, but it doesn't. And it's just dead silence in the entire house. After quite a while, and he still doesn't hear anything, he gets back in his bed. All the lights are on. His radio's on. And he tucks his legs up to his chin, and he's just holding himself basically in the fetal position. And he is, at this point, he's now just petrified. He had his big fight moment, but I think he's now thinking that this thing was just challenging me back. It's basically saying, I can do whatever I want to you, and you can't touch me. I can do whatever I want, you can't touch me. And he's realizing that maybe he could have made it worse, and he's sitting there knowing he's not going to sleep. It's still the middle of the night, and he starts hearing a noise that sounds like maybe shuffling of feet. Something's moving around underneath his bed. And as he's sitting on his bed, at the head of his bed near his pillow with his feet tucked in, he looks at the foot of his bed, and this huge, just wide, 6-foot-tall black figure emerges it's bright in the room. This black figure emerges at the foot of his bed. It's got this huge tooth coming out of its mouth, and it gets into this jerky position and starts moving towards Bill, and it gets right in front of him, and it puts its face right against Bill's, and then grunts and then disappears. Bill continued to see this horrible black figure in his house, and it continued to kind of challenge Bill, and Bill stopped challenging it back. And so Bill started waking up with these scratches on his chest. He was hospitalized a couple of times, prompting the hospital to do welfare checks on Bill because he was showing up with these mini heart attacks because of the stress that he claimed was from having this stuff happening to him. And his family's so concerned. And it wasn't until Bill started really doing some aggressive research on demons that he read about exorcisms. And he remembered that when he showed up for that house call, a lot of the language that he was hearing coming from that woman who was screaming, leave these people, leave this house, it sounded like an exorcism. And he was thinking that, do you think it's possible that the exorcist knew that she needed another host for these demons? And so she planned it so that she would have this water purification person show up right at 5 p.m. so that she could be at the part of her exorcism where she could cast the demons onto him. After 2 exorcisms of his own to his house, it still hasn't stopped. He still, to this day, is dealing with the paranormal activity in his house. And when asked why he hasn't sold his house, is he thinks that he couldn't live with himself if he ever put another person through what he has dealt with at his house. I don't know about you, but I would not have lived in that house for an additional 18 years. That just sounds like the worst. But, I'm not Bill, and so he's made up his mind that that's what he needs to do. But for me, anyways, I would have left that house. I would have abandoned that house more than likely. But I'd love to hear what you would do in that situation. And I'd love to just get your feedback on this story. It's interesting when you have a story like this coming from the mouth of someone so credible, like a NASA robotics engineer who's inherently skeptical, and having lots of corroborating evidence. I'd love to hear what you all think about this particular story and